Black Twitter is a bit of an anomaly. People gather there for a variety of different reasons, but if I were to explain it, I would say that it's a gathering of Black people and bystanders who come together to discuss prevalent topics in the Black community and other topics outside of the world writ large in a very Black way. It's also not necessarily linked to the specific app, Twitter. No, we don't call it X where I'm from. And that these conversations can essentially happen everywhere across the Black internet space, be it Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or Tumblr or YouTube. Also, the conversations that happen on these other sites eventually make their way to Black Twitter. So how I'm looking at Black Twitter is, of course, Black people on Twitter, but also our general social media use and our discussions that we're having online. In recent years, scholars have been talking about Black Twitter in a number of different ways. One way is the way that it shaped activism. A lot of people attribute the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement and the Say Her Name movements, among others, to Black Twitter and Black people organizing online. And it's become this space of activism where people talk about issues in the Black world and the world in general. It's been a place where people organize online and eventually take them offline, where people can have conversations about racism and sexism and combat negative stereotypes. And naturally, that becomes a place where we can be in community with each other, where we tell jokes and laugh and live watch BET Awards and Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder, and becomes this space of community and culture where we learn about each other, where we've found out how similar our lives are despite growing up on opposite sides of a country.
All across the globe, Black people would be Black.
Or it could be a place where we've learned about different cultures and communities outside of our own, in different countries, in different regions.
I know stuff about Black people in other countries that I ain't been to in my entire life because of Twitter. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I do need to go over there. That'll like some good-ass food over there.
It's also important to note, despite the good that can come out of it, that these places are situated in racism and other systemic issues. As the major tech companies of the world are creating these sites, these technologies, and algorithms, we know that it is not void of their racism, and despite the fact that it has been presented to us as this place of neutrality and where everyone is equal, we cannot deny that oppression still happens and occurs in these spaces. As a continuation of all of the wonderful scholarship that people have done about Black Twitter and Black internet space, I would like to discuss the contention that we see very often online. Given how global social media use has been in more recent years, we've all come in contact with people online who are not from the same backgrounds as us. And while many point out how communal and joyous Black Twitter is, even in the wake of outside racism from non-Black folk, it's hard to ignore the very present internal issues seen within the Black community. As Black people from across the globe continue to come together in this space, our differences come up in not so pleasant ways in what we call diaspora wars and gender wars. If you follow the diaspora wars on Black Twitter, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there is one common conversation that continues to come up, and that is the topic of who is Black and who isn't. This is a conversation that seems to have a lot of different layers, in that it's coming from people who presumably have very clear African ancestry, who do not identify themselves as being Black, or those particularly in Black America who believe that to be Black means that you are descendant of enslaved people in the United States. Some people call them foundational Black Americans or Africans descendant of slaves. Recently, South African pop star Tyla has been a topic in this conversation after she stated in a video that she is not Black but colored. So So the Diaspora Wars begin. Or continue. The main arguments that I saw was one, that Tyla is being marketed as black. Therefore, for her to show up in the market as seemingly a black woman and then turn around and say, I'm colored, seems like another case of non-black people cosplaying blackness or black culture for profit.
Well, tell me, how would you like to go to work for me?
Yeah, ma'am. How much you gonna pay me, I hope?
Well, let's see now. I'll pay you all your work.
No, ma'am. I gotta have some money.
The other argument in this is specifically about her use of the term colored and how it has very different implications for black people in the United States. On the other side of this argument were a number of people who were clearly not surprised at all that Tyla is claiming a colored identity. In his 1999 article, The Essential Social Fact of Race, Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues that race is a social phenomenon that takes place where a racial structure exists. Now, it has long been disputed that race is not biological and that humans across different races don't have that much genetic difference. However, what Bonilla Silva is arguing is that race is socially constructed. Not only is race socially constructed, the racialization process shows up different depending on the region that you're in. So, how we view race here in America is very different than how people view race in Brazil, which is the example that he gives in his article, versus how people in South Africa view race. I think this can explain this sort of ongoing conversation more broadly about the ideas of who is black and who isn't, because when people joke about Dominicans who are very dark-skinned and have kinky curly hair saying that they are not black, they're Dominican.
Sorry guys, but some of you guys be like, I know black, I know black, I know black, imposible, I know black, I'm Dominican, I'm Puerto Rican, I know black, be looking just like me.
Black people don't swim. Thank God I'm Dominican.
That is just a testament to the way that the racialization process has manifested very differently in different locations. Now, a conversation could be had about anti-blackness and how that plays into it, but again, that is also a part of racialization processes. So here in the US, where our economy was built historically off the backs of enslaved people, it's very important that you have as many laborers as possible, hence the one-drop rule. So for us, we more or less classify mixed people as black. So that racialization process is very different than South Africa, where under an apartheid state, there was the necessity to segregate different races. So South Africa recognizes different races being black, white, colored, and Indian. And the colored racial identity is what we may consider here in the US mixed or biracial. It makes space for people who are of black, white, or Asian backgrounds. Knowing that history, it becomes clear that the term colored has very different meanings in the United States versus in South Africa. However, they're both rooted in a history of colonialism, in a history of anti-blackness, anti-black racism, and are now, with the help of social media, in contention with each other based on the way those definitions have shaped in different parts of the world. The less obvious but still prevalent discourse that continues to plague Black Twitter is gender wars. And these conversations range from gay son versus thought daughter to submissive woman, sassy men.
It is a little sassy to me, but we are in a sassy man apocalypse, so you know.
One conversation in particular concerns me the most. It comes specifically from cisgendered Black women. After a trans rights activist on TikTok stated that cis women do not own periods, Just Hilarious went on a very long tirade, essentially sticking up for biological women.
How are you projecting your anger on real women? Because we are the gatekeepers. We are the gatekeepers for periods. We the only one that fucking bleed, honey. We the only ones that can give birth. We make y'all people. We make y'all. Y'all come from us. You can't be us. You will never. You're chasing something you'll never, ever get. You'll never be that.
There has been this clear attempt to firmly differentiate between biological women or cisgendered women and trans women. And similar to how we as a society are moving away from biological claims or essentializations of race, the same is happening with gender, in that we are no longer linking gendered identity solely based off of biology. In the United States and abroad, gender has largely been pathologized, specifically women and womanhood. And in these discussions about who owns womanhood and biological women, particularly coming directly from Black women, I am unfortunately seeing the links to white women's claim to the cult of true womanhood. This was an ideology in the 19th century that was mainly afforded to white, middle, and upper class women that set the tone for gender roles in the US. Women were only allowed to exist in private domestic spaces and not in the public sphere where men are, meaning that the labor that white women do is limited to the home and men are the ones who are laboring in the public sphere. Black women have never been included in this idea of womanhood, along with working class white women and other women of color. And as many Black feminists have claimed, the constructions of gender and race are inextricably linked, in that the experiences, the expectations of white women are not the same as the experiences and expectations of Black women are not the experiences and expectations of Black men. And as Black women have continuously fought to be seen as equal, to be seen as valued in this space, some of us have bought into ideas of womanhood, ideas of the gendered binary, and now feel the need to perpetuate that elsewhere and become the gatekeepers of womanhood, or at least tried to. And one argument that I see often is that trans women are merely performing what they think to be womanhood and that they will never truly embody it because of the biological assignments that we have placed on womanhood. So having a uterus or having periods or having children. And the issue with that is that not all cis women have periods, not all cis women can have children. Everyone who has periods are not cis women or biological women. And essentially all gender is performance, whether or not you identify with the gender you're assigned to at birth. What this conversation unfortunately does is recreates the expectations of what gender is or isn't that are unfortunately rooted in the ability to be a mother and in a capitalist society rooted in the ability to produce laborers. What both of these conversations, and many of them like it, boil down to is identity. Who gets to define identity? Who gets to say what it is and what it isn't? Whose identities are allowed to exist and whose identities are pathologized? And when we live in a world where our oppression is linked to the way that our oppressors identify us, it is very important for us to question them. And I'm not saying that we should get rid of identity or these definitions altogether, because I don't think that that's the answer. It's still important to recognize that race and gender are socially constructed, and the ways in which we define them or not define them play a very important role. It's still important to know that race and gender are what they are today because of a multitude of oppressive systems. In Black feminist thought, Patricia Hill Collins says, Black feminist critic Barbara Christian asserts that in the United States, the enslaved African woman became the basis for the definition of our society's other. Maintaining images of U.S. Black women as the other provides ideological justification for race, gender, and class oppression. Certain basic ideas cross-cut these and other forms of oppression. One such idea is binary thinking that categorizes people, things, and ideas in terms of their difference from one another. For example, each term in the binaries, white, black, male, female, reason, emotion, culture, nature, fact, opinion, mind, body, and subject, object gains meaning only in relation to its counterpart. Another basic idea concerns how binary thinking shapes understandings of human difference. In such thinking, difference is defined in oppositional terms. One part is not simply different from its counterpart, it is inherently opposed to its other. Whites and blacks, males and females, thought and feeling are not complementary counterparts. They are fundamentally different entities related only through their definition as opposites. Feeling cannot be incorporated into thought or even function in conjunction with it because in binary oppositional thinking, feeling retards thought and values obscure facts. What Collins is talking about here is how we define things in opposition to each other. And in that, there are these parameters that we put around these definitions that when we see people who defy these definitions or don't fit neatly into them, we have very adverse reactions to them. And I think specifically for those of us, for Black people, we have consistently been told who we are, and then eventually we start to reshape these definitions. But as we're reshaping these definitions in our context, we are not considering how others do or do not, or kind of bend the rules in ways that we never thought to see or didn't consider or just weren't present in that location where these definitions were being constructed. And in a paper by Audre Lorde titled Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, she talks about this a little bit more specifically in the context of Western European history and how we've been conditioned in the West to see difference in opposition to each other and how that difference in turn in some way should be suppressed. And in this paper she says, institutionalized rejection of difference is an absolute necessity in a profit economy which needs outsiders as surplus people. As members of such an economy, we have all been programmed to respond to the human differences between us with fear and loathing and to handle that difference in one of three ways. Ignore it, and if that is not possible, copy it if we think it is dominant, or destroy it if we think it is subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across human differences as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in the service of separation and confusion. Here, I want to call to the two of three ways that we have been conditioned to deal with difference, and that is to ignore it and destroy it. I think in both of these examples, we've seen people come in contact with difference, and the immediate reaction or the knee-jerk reaction is to ignore in literal ignorance, maybe not even deny that you exist, but to not even recognize the existence in the first place. And in that, I think that's where destruction happens, because when we refuse to identify something, that's how cultures get lost, that's how ideas get lost, that's how people get lost. It's the refusal to actually see a thing. And that can be very damaging. It is very damaging, and it has been very damaging throughout history. This, however, does not mean that we accept this as norm. We can move forward. So then the question is, how do we continue to be in community with each other despite our differences? How do we embrace our differences and make space for everyone, especially when our difference in ways that we believe to be the same or we thought to be the same, and we're finding that we're not. We're using the same terms but are coming to them with very different definitions. And of course, Audre Lorde gives us something to think through. She says, change means growth, and growth can be painful, but we sharpen self-definition by exposing the self in work and struggle together with those whom we define as different from ourselves, although sharing the same goals. The first part of this is self-definition, in that in order to even enter a conversation about difference with other people, you should be very aware of who you are, like how you define yourself. I think what's sometimes missing in our self-definitions is the history of us. The constructions of race and gender as we know it today are dependent and heavily linked to a lot of systemic issues and a lot of systemic oppression. As Black people, as Black women, we have constantly been reshaping and rethinking how we view ourselves based on the definitions of Black that have been given to us, based on the definitions of Black women that have been given to us. And we think about these things in relation to what others are saying, like the external identifiers or the external definitions versus the internal or the self identifiers or the self definitions. And it's so important to keep those histories and those connections in mind, not only in your own regional or national histories, but also as we are online and we're coming up against people who come from different nations, different states, even different cities, different countries. We have to consider that their definitions, their ideas, their histories are different. And once we recognize that, we can come to the conversation with knowledge about ourselves, with knowledge about how to communicate ourselves with others. And once we know that I exist in this space and I'm content in how I exist in this space, I can allow you to freely exist how you want. As long as it doesn't cause harm, you should be able to make space for everyone around you. And that once you know yourself, you're comfortable and rooted enough in yourself to know that people can be different and that difference is okay. And it's actually good to learn about people's differences in order to make you or shape you into a better, well-rounded human being. The most important part is sharing the same goals. I would hope all of us want the same things. We all want to live very fulfilled and happy lives. We want food on our table and clothes on our backs and a place to lay our head down at night. And we want friends and family and joy and laughter and art and community. And in this world, a lot of us, specifically in the Black community, are trying to combat anti-Black racism, colonialism, imperialism, the material and ideological effects of all of these systems of oppression that have continually been plaguing our communities. Once we know that we're all on the same page, the eventual end goal is to rid ourselves from strife. We can hopefully understand each other just a little better, and that you may talk this way or walk this way or say things this way. That does not have to mean that we are enemies. It can mean that I can learn from you and you can learn from me, and in that learning, we all become better people. We all can show up better for ourselves, for our communities, and we don't have to feel threatened or fearful or triggered even by the presence of someone who's different. We should feel excited when we meet people who we can learn from and we can grow with. This is not to say that this is all that Black Twitter is or all that Black internet spaces are, because there are a number of ways in which we use the digital space to connect with each other, to learn from one another, to grow with each other, to learn about our different experiences across the globe. But especially when our use of these social media sites are essentially loading the pockets of the ruling class, it seems more beneficial long term to use these tools to our advantage rather than to separate us, to further divide us, so that if and when and as these social sites come and go, we have built the tools and connections with each other that we can take into the material world. We can be at least one step further to our liberation, to us dismantling these systems of oppression, and that we can show up in a world where we exist freely as ourselves in relation to one another.